Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased today to rise in this House for my first speech of 2014 and welcome all my colleagues back to speak today about the Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement. This agreement represents yet another important step in the diversification of our trade relationships around the world and our efforts to find new markets and to grow markets for Canadian goods and services. The priority of our government has been focused on opportunity and prosperity for Canadian families. This begins and ends with ensuring that our producers and firms have new markets to trade their wares. Trade leads to employment, Mr. Speaker, and prosperity for Canadian families. Whether the towns of Bowmanville, Port Perry or Uxbridge in my riding, or indeed the cities and towns across the country, families are made stronger by the simple fact that mom or dad can find meaningful employment if they want to be engaged in the workplace. In fact, Canadian exports already account for an astonishing 1 in 5 Canadian jobs. Over 40,000 Canadian companies are global exporters. Canadian companies and their innovative products are leaders in sectors ranging from aerospace, transportation, agriculture, to information and communications technology. With trade being critical to Canada's prosperity, Canada has long been a key architect of international trade rules at the World Trade Organization, through the Free Trade Agreement with the United States, and ultimately with NAFTA. Our country relies upon strong international agreements and treaties to counter protectionism and keep global markets open for our employers. We remain very engaged and positive about our most important trade relationship with the United States. Trade with the United States has been a defining part of the Canadian story. From North-South mercantile trade before Confederation, to the national policy of Sir John A., to the Free Trade Agreement signed by the Conservative government in 1988, trade with our American friends has brought prosperity to generations of Canadian families, Mr. Speaker. The need to diversify Canadian trade relationships has been raised for decades because of a growing dependence on trade with the U.S., and this need to diversify came into sharp focus with the global recession in 2008. In 2008, Canadian exports to the United States totaled $368 billion. The following year, amid the global economic crisis, these exports dropped to $270 billion. While there has been a recovery in the U.S. economy and exports have been rebounding, statistics from 2012 show that our exports to the U.S. still remain 10% below 2008 levels. The strong economic leadership of our Prime Minister and this government has helped Canada weather the global turmoil better than most developed countries. But we cannot rest on our laurels when it comes to trade. We also must come up with a dual strategy that builds and strengthens our critical trade relationships now, while also building new and growing markets to sell our goods and services. The global economy, Mr. Speaker, is changing rapidly, and new markets are exploding around the world. Trade is helping lift millions out of poverty, while also promoting peace and security through stronger international engagement. Canada needs to pursue these new markets that are growing with gusto. We need to not only keep up with our global competitors, but to leverage our natural advantages to penetrate new markets faster and deeper than our competitors. Standing still will not create jobs for Canadian families, and over time, inaction could erode our position in the world and our quality of life. This is why our government has responded with an ambitious international trade agenda. Opening new markets for Canadian companies, large and small, is cornerstone to this plan as we continue to grow the Canadian economy and the jobs in our economy created as a result of trade. We've made significant progress on opening new markets for Canadian goods and services. Last October, the Prime Minister announced an agreement in principle on the Canadian-European Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, the most ambitious trade agreement Canada has ever negotiated. Our agreement with the European Union will give Canadian companies preferential access to an economy of more than 500 million consumers and a 17 trillion GDP. Tremendous opportunity, Mr. Speaker. A joint study by Canada and the EU as part of our negotiations concluded that our agreement with the European Union could boost Canada's GDP by $12 billion annually and increase bilateral trade by 20%. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, the deal could result in the creation of 80,000 net new jobs once the benefits of the Canada-EU trade agreement are realized. While the Canada-EU trade agreement represents the culmination of many years of work with a group of nations, with our provincial stakeholders, with industries, with the municipalities who are eager to access the 500 million consumers of Europe, our government has also been tirelessly pursuing trade opportunities in markets of all sizes. Since 2007, our government has concluded free trade agreements with Peru, Colombia, Jordan, and Morocco. New agreements and relationships are being struck, while existing ones are being expanded. We have also concluded or brought into force 22 new or updated foreign investment promotion and protection agreements to provide better access to growing global markets for Canadian exporters, while also providing more certainty in these markets through the secure framework that a foreign investment promotion and protection agreement offers. It gives me great pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to advise this House that Honduras will soon be yet another market that we have opened for Canadian employers through this Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement. While our EU deal represents Canadian opportunities across the pond for our exporters, there are also tremendous opportunities here in the Americas. Total merchandise trade between Canada and the countries in the Americas stands at $56.2 billion in 2012. This has increased by 32% in the last 6 years alone. Canadian direct investment in the Americas totals $168 billion in 2012 and has increased by 59% over the same period. We are already engaged in South and Central America, and our government knows that we need to do more in our own backyard. Canada's trade agenda is not just about the planes, trains, and automobiles we manufacture in Canada, the great ones to boot, nor does it only represent natural resources and agricultural products. We are increasingly pursuing markets for our intellectual property, our academic excellence, and our delivery of professional services around the world. Canada is very much engaged in negotiations surrounding the Trade and Services Agreement, which will provide a secure legal framework and new market access for Canadian service suppliers in many of the world's most important and growing service markets. We also remain an active participant in multilateral negotiations at the World Trade Organization, where just a few weeks ago, Canada helped conclude a trade facilitation agreement which will boost trade by cutting red tape for Canadian companies. But, Mr. Speaker, we're not just stopping there. Canada is also committed to advancing our ongoing free trade negotiations with other partners in the Caribbean, in Morocco, and here in the Americas. We are also looking for new opportunities to grow Canada's international trade and are undertaking exploratory discussions with Thailand and Turkey to determine what benefits Canadians and Canadian employers could see from trade agreements with these partners in the future. In addition, we continue to update our existing free trade agreements in order to ensure that Canada remains a global leader in trade and commerce. We recently announced the modernization of the Canada-Chile Free Trade Agreement. This expansion and modernization builds on an agreement that dates back to 1997 and a trade relationship that is now worth over $2.5 billion. The updated agreement with Chile includes the addition of a new financial services chapter, which will help world-class Canadian financial institutions develop new markets in the areas of banking, insurance, and asset management in Chile. It also includes new roles on government procurement, customs procedures, and dispute settlement. As you are aware, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister announced last week that we will also modernize our existing free trade agreement with Israel. The Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement really has been a cornerstone of a growing and important relationship for our country. While our countries enjoy a sophisticated trade relationship, an updated free trade agreement with Israel will enhance bilateral commercial flows by reducing technical barriers, enhancing cooperation, increasing transparency in regulatory matters, and reducing transaction costs for exporters. It will also create greater visibility for Canadian companies in the Israeli and Middle Eastern market and support closer ties with this dynamic economy and important democracy in the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the government is working hard to ensure that Canadians reap the economic benefits of global trade, which I said at the outset accounts for 1 in 5 jobs in Canada. The Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement is part of our efforts to liberalize trade with our partners here in the Americas. It is also a realization of our Global Markets Action Plan, which will grow existing and important trade relationships while forging new ones around the world. The Americas offer great potential. Trade has been growing dramatically in the last 6 years, as I said. We also need to promote increased mutual economic sharing of ideas and increase engagement. Canada's strategy for engagement in the Americas focuses on intensifying trade promotion and relationship building efforts to ensure that the Canadian private sector can take full advantage of the trade and economic agreements, as well as helping to build the capacity of our trading partners to capitalize on the benefits of free trade with Canada and the benefits that come along with a growing and emerging middle class in many of these countries. Canada is committed to a strong economic partnership with Honduras that will contribute to enhanced prosperity and sustainable economic growth for both our countries in the long term, Mr. Speaker. This Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement is a key component in advancing the goals of Canada's strategy for engagement in the Americas and will support our growing commercial and social relationship with that country. Canada's two-way merchandise trade with Honduras grew by 46% in the last 6 years. Canadian companies are active in Honduras in the areas of apparel production and mining, but there are other sectors of huge potential opportunity, such as green building, clean technologies, information and communications technologies, to name just a few, Mr. Speaker. Once implemented, the Canada-Honduras Free Trade Agreement will eliminate tariffs on 98% of the tariff lines going both ways. We will gain better access to a growing market in our hemisphere, with grain and oil seeds, beef, pork, potatoes, and processed foods being some of the early and big winners, and the potential for more industries, and particularly service areas, as the relationship with Honduras develops over time. Canada's Trade Commissioner Service already works with Canadian companies that are interested in doing business in Honduras. These are recognizable and important employers across Canada, Mr. Speaker. We'll recognize these names: Gildan Activewear, Aura Minerals, and Canadian Banknote, to name just a few. Once the trade agreement is ratified, our trade commissioners will ensure that companies, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises, are aware of how they can benefit from this free trade agreement so that they can take full advantage of the greater transparency, stability, and protection the agreement will provide in the Honduran market. In addition to opening doors for Canadian companies and building our trade relationship, Canada is also committed to supporting Honduras in other ways. Canada and Honduras first established diplomatic relations in 1961 and have a broad and diverse relationship driven by a wide range of links and collaboration, from political dialogue and commercial exchange to people-to-people ties, as well as a long-standing and substantial Canadian development component. We maintain an open dialogue with the government of Honduras, as we believe that engagement is the best way for us to help Honduras meet its challenges, grow its economy, and promote stability. Engagement on all levels will grow prosperity and security for Hondurans. As one of the 20 countries of focus for Canada's development assistance, Honduras is Canada's largest bilateral program in Central America and the fourth largest in the hemisphere. In 2011-2012, Canada provided over $39 million to the country through all development channels. This makes it the third largest bilateral donor in all of Honduras and the sixth largest overall donor in that part of the hemisphere. Canada's development program will support and promote economic opportunities in Honduras in a way that will allow our trade with Honduras to grow steadily over time. Mr. Speaker, it is our view that prosperity, security, and democratic governance, including full respect for human rights, are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. Increased prosperity through trade can contribute to the reduction of poverty and social exclusion by increasing economic opportunity for all Hondurans. Once ratified, this free trade agreement will be a cornerstone of our bilateral relationship with Honduras and will benefit both our countries. This is a comprehensive trade deal that will give Canadian businesses a secure and predictable framework in a growing Honduran marketplace. The United States and the European Union already enjoy free trade with Honduras, so it is especially important that we ratify this agreement and put Canadian companies on a level playing field with our main competitors. Let me turn to some specific examples of the benefits from the Canadian-Honduras trade agreement. First and foremost, it will help make Canadian products more attractive in the Honduran market by eliminating tariffs. Today, Canadian exports to Honduras face, on average, tariffs in the 11% range for agriculture and the 5% range for non-agricultural goods. Once the agreement is in place, Honduras will immediately eliminate tariffs on almost 70% of its tariff lines in respect to goods imported from Canada. This agreement, Mr. Speaker, represents an important component of our government's Global Markets Action Plan. This plan, Mr. Speaker, collaborates the funding and expertise inherent in our foreign policy, in our trade, and in our development arms, and focuses them in countries where we can make a difference, recognizing that benefiting the social and human rights of a country will also help benefit their local economy, and recognizing that jobs for Hondurans will help promote stability in the country. Mr. Speaker, this government is on an unparalleled track for promoting trade of our goods and services across the world. The Canada-EU trade agreement represents a huge leap in terms of global trade agreements in that it will provide opportunity for Canadian exporters to a market of 500 million people while also allowing penetration right down to services, mutual recognition of professions. It really is taking trade agreements into this new millennium that we're in, Mr. Speaker. In my community, in my riding of Durham, 1 in 5 jobs relate to trade, Mr. Speaker. The communities of Uxbridge, Scugog, and Clarington need these new markets for our goods, particularly at a time where the American market is slowly rebounding from the 2008 economic world crisis. Our government is firmly committed to building new markets for our goods and services to maintain this important role in job creation that trade promotes. These deals are not just with mammoth 500 million markets like the Canada-EU trade deal, but they're also in important areas of the world like in Jordan, Morocco, and now Honduras, where our trade and our prioritization of our services and our engagement through our Global Market Action Plan can not only promote trade in that country, but can also promote stability and promote engagement in a range of labor, environmental, and a plethora of areas. So, Mr. Speaker, This is a pivotal part of our government's global market action plan. It's a pivotal part of keeping Canadian families employed and engaged, and I'm truly hoping all members of this House will support this important agreement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Extending preferential trade terms to other countries is a major economic privilege, and countries who are democratic, respect environmental, human rights, and labour standards are deserving of this extension. Now, the government of Honduras was essentially installed in a military coup in 2009, has conducted two flawed elections since then that have been roundly condemned as corrupt, violates its citizens' human rights, suppresses freedom of speech and association, tolerates killings, kidnappings, and arbitrary detentions of thousands of its citizens, has the highest murder rate in the world, is the planet's most dangerous place for journalists, represses the media, opposition, and citizens who peacefully express their political views, is a major drug trafficking center with 80% of cocaine shipments from South America, has an average of 10 massacres per month, and allows paramilitary squads to operate with impunity. My question is, Canadians wouldn't support a free trade agreement with the government of Ukraine or North Korea or Iran. Why does this government believe that they should support an agreement with Honduras that has equally as bad a record in violating the democratic and human rights standards, not only of Honduras, but of Canada and the world?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague from the Trade Committee for his direct question. What troubles me about the position that the New Democratic Party takes on trade, Mr. Speaker, is they're continuing their decades, almost generational-long opposition to trade of any kind. And in fact, this honourable member, in an interview with the Huffington Post, when talking about countries like Honduras, Peru, Chile, important countries and allies of ours in the Americas, Mr. Speaker, he said that these countries should not be considered, and he actually said they have no strategic value for Canada, Mr. Speaker. That is not diplomacy at its finest, Mr. Speaker. We are about promoting economic opportunity and jobs in massive markets, Mr. Speaker, like 500 million that the Canadian-European trade agreement will lead to, but also in smaller markets where our input and where our engagement will actually benefit Hondurans and promote stability in that region, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I have to the member for Vancouver East on his point and the Parliamentary Secretary's answer. One has to ask, where won't this government go just to add another number and say we now have X number of trade agreements? Because that's what it's all about. I listened to the words of the Parliamentary Secretary, and he went to great lengths to use all the right words in all the right places, but their facts on trade don't bear out his words, Mr. Speaker. This is the first government that had a trade deficit in 30 years. He talked about the CETA agreement to great length, not Honduras, and he said could create X number of jobs. Could, we haven't even seen the text yet. It hasn't even been given in the Parliament of Canada. What he did say, though, Mr. Speaker, he said there's new rules on dispute settlement. And I have a question on that. You know, we know that they've had 32 of the last 44 months have had a trade deficit, Mr. Speaker, but on the dispute settlement, in our agreement with the United States, Canada's beef industry is suffering badly because of the aged cattle restriction that the Americans have on, and because of the cool country origin labeling agreement. I asked the member, can he tell me, instead of negotiating with Honduras, which has a terrible human rights record, what are they doing to settle the trade dispute with the United States that really matters to Canadian farmers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from Malpeque for the question. In that question/statement, he asked what lengths we would go to. I think it's clear, Mr. Speaker, that this government will go and sell Canadian goods and services abroad as much as possible if it'll lead to jobs here at home. I'd remind the honourable member that in the 13 years of Liberal government, they signed 3 trade agreements. 3. In fact, the Prime Minister's recent trip to Israel were expanding on the less than ambitious trade deal they signed with that country. So, Mr. Speaker, we are clearly about promoting trade for our country. And as I said, I used the European deal as an example. In big markets and in small markets, if there's a win for Canadians and our world-class goods, services, and products, we will be there for Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to say that I was enormously grateful to the member for Vancouver Kingsway for so clearly reciting the reasons that this bill before us is odious, as is the trade agreement. To rush into a trade deal with a country that's just had a populist leader in a democracy knocked out by a coup, to have a military regime that suppresses human rights, Indigenous rights, labor rights, and that we would rush to an agreement which will only and primarily benefit those parts of Canada, and I love my country, but when I see Canadian mining companies take advantage of Indigenous rights in other countries and then be supported by an agreement like this, which will give that Canadian mining company the kind of rights I don't want the Chinese state-owned enterprises to have to bring arbitration cases against us if we toughen our laws, this agreement will work against the interests of equity, democracy, civil society, and human rights in Honduras. And I would beg my honourable friend, who is an honourable friend, the Parliamentary Secretary, to have nothing to do with promoting this agreement.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my friend from Saanich Gulf Islands and welcome her back to a new year of jousting in this place. Mr. Speaker, I think there is a philosophical disagreement with our government and the opposition, including the Green Party, that really wants to isolate Canadians and isolate our opportunity to create jobs while our largest trading partner is having slow growth. We are outselling our markets and our goods and services, but we're also engaging, Mr. Speaker. And I think the honourable member should look and see that this agreement has a corporate social responsibility component, it has a labour component, it has an environmental component. And Mr. Speaker, I believe firmly that engagement and elevating countries that are struggling into the global community where these things are taken very seriously will not only enhance those countries, it will deal with those root issues. And Mr. Speaker, our Global Markets Action Plan not only targets the economic opportunities that trade promotes, but it also strengthens our diplomatic work by targeting some of our aid, by targeting our diplomacy and growing jobs at the same time, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, the honourable member. L'honorable député de Mackerel.
The honourable member for Mackerel-Fortin. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the comments of the Parliamentary Secretary, and I would like to point out that there are philosophical differences on the importance of free trade between our party and your party. But in this file, that is not what is important. It is with whom we signed these agreements. You cannot guarantee that the government in place in Honduras will not use this free trade agreement to foster the illicit transport of cocaine. That's the point we're at. The crime rate in that country is 50 times higher than it is in Canada. It is clear that the political authorities of Honduras are criminal elites. So how can you even think of signing an agreement with people who are such obvious criminals? That's the question. Thank you.
Secretary Parliament.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for the question. I think it's very important to note, Mr. Speaker, that we are trading with Honduras now. They are a key destination for our aid now. They are trading and have free trade agreements with the United States and with the European Union now, putting Canadian job creators at a disadvantage. My position has been clear, Mr. Speaker, and I'd ask him to challenge his colleagues in a party that have been isolationist and anti-trade for 50 years to say that this is a way we engage with countries and actually help lift their economy out of much more difficult circumstances while also promoting jobs and creation here in our country, Mr. Speaker, and our changes to DFAT-D and making sure that we not only target economic opportunity alongside with aid, engagement, institution building, this will actually help the people of Honduras, Mr. Speaker. The isolation of the opposition will do no good.
Resuming debate.